Hello, I'm James Riley from Innovation Oz. Welcome to Critical Connections, the latest episode in the Cybersecurity, the Digital Backbone podcast series produced by Innovation Oz in partnership with our friends at CyberArk. Today I have with me Lani Refiti, the Chief Executive of IoTSec Australia. Hi, Lani.
Hey, James.
And Jeffery, the Vice President Solutions Engineers for Privileged Access Management Specialist CyberArk. Okay, in this series, we've been discussing the changing face of privileged identity, and we've touched on issues of 5G and IoT reasonably frequently in those discussions. But today we're going to take a little bit more of a deep dive and look at, I guess, scale issues. Once the 5G rollouts happens in earnest, we'll see that proliferation of different applications, large and small, that are kind of economy-wide or society-wide. Certainly, when we start talking in terms of smart cities and smart factories and smart precincts and those kinds of things, we're talking about a layer of application that really does present some cybersecurity challenges. Specifically, we will get into, to start this discussion, the notion of critical infrastructure. And I'm going to, I think I'll go to Lani Refiti first on this, and then maybe pass it to you, Jeffery, to look at, how different nation states compare in the protection of these critical infrastructures. So to Lani, I'll just ask you, what do we even mean by critical infrastructure in a 5G enabled world?
That's a good question, James. I mean, traditionally we've used the definition of any sectors, industries, assets, etc., that are crucial to the economic as well as social future of a country, right? And so that traditionally in Australia, that has meant things like ports. Ports bring food into a country. We are an import, heavy country in terms of a lot of our food and etc. So ports, water, and power were primarily sort of the assets or the sectors that we covered. And I'm sure we'll cover off later the amendments to the Critical Infrastructure Bill that we've currently got sitting in the Senate under review by the Joint Intelligence Committee, looking to expand that across a number of other sectors: healthcare, medical, space technology, etc., and the ramifications it will have on those industries, as well as supply chain is becoming very, very crucial given the SolarWinds recent attack, and so what that means for adjacent organizations, defense contractors, etc., that sort of form part of that ecosystem.
Okay, so let's. But just before I get to you, Jeffery, I suppose in a 5G enabled world, and when we start talking in terms of things like mass automation, self-driving cars, and all the infrastructure that surrounds that, and automated logistics, and these kinds of things, all driven by many millions or perhaps even billions of sensor devices. Distributed around the economy. So I suppose at a very basic level, these are presenting quite huge challenges to those people who look after the networks. Jeffery, what do you think?
Well, we are on the good news is that we've got a precursor to 5G, which was actually 4G with LTE. So a lot of the learnings that we had from there has become the foundation of where we need to grow for 5G. But you're absolutely right. 5G greatly enhances the scale and the reach of these IoT and the connected devices. So, the plus side is that we've got a head start. We've got a couple of 5 years. A lot of the, I would say, the back-end technologies already exist. You hardly hear about the backends, especially those that are running in the cloud, to be a cause of concern. I think what is really new is the connected devices itself, the smart individual devices that's out, in the field, in the plantations that's running around. A lot of these are new, and while they are new, the advantage is today we have great automation, right? You have a lot of, RPA, DevOps, a lot of automation technologies that allow us to help to manage these devices. So we're not talking about individual people having to go in and manage individually all the devices. Most of these will be automated. I think the only concern that I see is because these devices are new, everyone is rushing to the market. And feature functions and time to market is more important than, say, security of the device. So I think that is where the primary gap would be.
Can I just ask you on that then? Maybe you can describe for us this Smart Nation program in Singapore. I should have mentioned earlier, Jeffery is based in Singapore. And I'm sort of interested, the Singaporean government tends to get out in front of these things ahead of national peers. So the structure of that, we were talking earlier, and you mentioned that the cybersecurity component is built into that Smart Nations program. So I guess that's a fundamental layer if you're trying to design smart city infrastructure, to have that cybersecurity layer from the get-go.
Yep, absolutely. Well, for folks outside Singapore who might not know about the Smart Nation, it's a government-led initiative that started back in 2014. And basically, the whole idea is a series of projects with the objective to drive pervasive adoption of digital and smart technology in Singapore so that we can improve efficiency as a nation and improve the quality of life. Now, that particular, there's a whole range of projects, everything from national identification, national digital identification, to smart sensors that goes around everywhere. But as soon as they launched this, they realized that we need security to protect, Smart Nation, which is why a year after, Singapore started the CSA, or the Cybersecurity Agency, with the mandate to protect the critical infrastructures of Singapore, creating standards, creating guidelines, and, everything from your day-to-day IoT devices that you use at home, all the way to what the utilities and your transportation will need to adhere to. So yes, it is, it was with security foresight in mind, and it's many years in the making, and we're still only scratching the surface.
Yeah.
The cybersecurity labeling scheme, basically they put a sticker on the devices that they validate to have, a certain degree of security. That only came out in the last 1 to 2 years.
So, look, in the introduction to that question, I think I was talking about smart cities. The program is obviously Smart Nation, as Jeffrey's just explained. Lani, what do you make of this point of when we talk proliferation of devices and the sort of accelerated rush to build devices to drive that, drive some of those programs? To Jeffrey's point, that there is a danger that they're not putting cybersecurity first in the development or the design of those devices.
It's an unfortunate truth, James. And look, IoT is not new. I mean, I first started working in the IoT space back in 2010. I think it's 2009, 2010. Working, robotics, etc., in steel factories. It's not new. The actual proliferation is increasing. I forget now what Gartner's looking at in terms of the number of devices that are being rolled out. The challenge has always been taking the and it's unfortunately a bit of a cliche, but taking that secure by design approach to IoT, where its security is built in, not only in terms of technology but also in terms of process, government initiatives, as Jeffrey just covered with the Singaporean initiatives. And unfortunately, it just hasn't been done. I speak 4 or 5 times a year at conferences, not since the COVID era, around IoT security in general. And I've got to say that each year I turn up and say the same thing. And unfortunately, I don't report that there's been much more movement in terms from an industry perspective, from a sector perspective, around building that secure by design into it. And we all know, even from the corporate IT side, we all know that if you can build security in as part of a project or build it in as part of the system, it's a lot easier, it's a lot cheaper in the long run than if you have to try and bolt it on, after the fact. But unfortunately, we've gone down the same route when it comes to IoT security.
It's kind of it is Yeah, it is slightly amazing that Australia certainly doesn't have a centralised cybersecurity agency in the whole of government manner of Singapore. But interesting also.
We do as in sorts. The challenge we have versus Singapore is that we have three levels of government, right, which makes it always harder to orchestrate things like policy, regulations, etc. We have Home Affairs, which sort of houses the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, the ACSC, and they've got out in the regions, they've got what they call joint cybersecurity centres. So they're out there doing that. You've got the Australian Signals Directorate, which is defence-aligned initiative that looks at, provides a similar functionality as the NSA does in the US. So we do have agencies, and each of the state governments then have their own agencies. Here in Queensland, where I am, we have the Queensland Cybersecurity Unit, but again, they look after a certain subset. And so that is the challenge. And when you talk smart cities, that's also the challenge, where we have these three different levels of government, three different levels of funding, areas of responsibilities overlap, and sometimes leave gaps as well.
Yeah, I do wonder about the messaging though. Certainly from the federal government side, there's no. I mean, yes, these bodies exist within Home Affairs, but there doesn't it's not a. It does. Well, there's no cybersecurity minister. Is one issue, I suppose.
Yeah.
So the
or
messaging,
advisor.
Yeah, and so the messaging does tend to get a little bit fragmented. Lani, just before we leave you, the IoTSec Australia, can you just talk us through the role that you play within the ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. Look, we set up, a group of us set up IoTSec Australia back in 2017 when we sort of foresaw that security was going to be a bolt-on. There were a lot of these gaps. Awareness was very minimal. So we really set it up as an industry not-for-profit initiative to work with organizations like Innovation Oz, even security vendors, work with government departments to take an active approach in raising awareness and advocating for that secure by design approach to IoT, specifically in critical infrastructure, power, water, smart cities, etc. And so, we often, as I said, speak regularly at conferences, joint research papers with universities, etc., projects with that remit of raising awareness around the security of the IoT ecosystem.
Yeah, as you mentioned before, Jeffrey, we kind of do have the systems and the technology to manage a lot of this. Well, certainly to manage this risk. I guess you always accept a certain level of risk, but there are ways of locking things down. So can it really just be about awareness? Is it just human behavior? Where are we up to with that?
So I think it's more than just human behavior. And I mean, first thing, human is part of the critical cog to the securing 5G and everything else, because everything starts with humans. And education is not new, but it needs to be a continuous. It can't be a single campaign. It needs to be continuous and needs to be ongoing, because there's always something new. And there are always new people coming into the ecosystem, right? Your children, they grow up to be adults. They need to be taught from young. And likewise, the elderly that might have missed out the earlier education needs to continue to hit in there. But also educating not just on security, but on the other processes and the regulations. I think where it's frequently missed out is while we're educating the awareness, we might not be educating on all the best practices, all the processes that people need to follow, right? Just think about something as simple as strong passwords. We've been talking about it for decades, right? But every year you still see the top weak passwords is the same ones that's been there for the last decades. And if you ask the audience how many people actually practice strong passwords and they rotate it on a regular basis, right? And just expand that out beyond passwords to everything else that you need for security and governance. But I think beyond the process and the people, there's also the role that government can come in. It needs to come in, besides educating the public, is to set the security framework, set the security standards, right? And with that, set in the laws to enforce. What if there's gross negligence in compliance? Because security comes at a cost to the business, cost in time and people. And where organizations can, sometimes it tend to be overlooked because, it's more important to say, be faster to the market or have more compelling features than something that is more secure but doesn't appeal to everybody else. So having, the laws to, put the awareness to drive the consequences if there are lapses and would help. And last but not least, the governance around it. You can have the law, but you still need people to police the law. You need the auditors, you need the governance body to, get everybody, think about today, right? Like in Singapore, we have to wear masks, but just telling everybody need to wear masks is not enough. You need people to go around to catch people who are wearing masks and then reminding them that, hey, this is something that we all need to comply for the greater security of everybody else.
So, Lani, what do you think about that? I think I can hear the business community screaming from here. I mean, we've always talked about, the need, I guess, for better technical skills on boards or better cyber skills on boards. And really, I suppose the best way to do that would to regulate around, massive fines or punishments for data breaches. That would certainly get some people on board. What do you think?
Oh, look, I think so. I mean, having been in security now for the last 23 years, I can tell you awareness is not enough. Awareness is only the beginning. I often describe it as awareness is the door that you've got to walk through in order to make, to take action, right? So awareness needs to be followed by action. And there's plenty of, I have a psychology background. There's plenty of theories that I've looked at to describe why people simply don't, or organizations simply don't invest enough in their, cybersecurity in order to appropriately manage their risks, right? Things like prospect theory, etc. For me, it helps to explain that. But I agree, it has to be a combination of, regulatory, and we're talking government action as well as the different regulators that regulate different sectors. For instance, here in Australia, the banking sector's superannuation is regulated by a body called APRA, and they have their own now cybersecurity framework that they're enforcing. The power industry is regulated by a body called AEMO, which last year released a new sort of cybersecurity framework. So I think in different regulators in different sectors, as well as from a government level, the critical infrastructure bill, mandatory breach disclosure is one of them. You simply have to have many levers to try and solve this challenge. Awareness itself, and trusting that businesses will do, the right thing, because sometimes doing the right thing from a cyber perspective and the profit, sort of margin, etc., sometimes go head to head. So I think it, Jeffery described it beautifully. I think you need a range of different methods to help solve this challenge.
I think you brought up earlier that security legislation, or the critical infrastructure legislation that's sitting in the Senate now, being looked at. Now there is I guess there is a concern, I suppose, or concern among smaller businesses that they'll get swept up in that legislation because they'll suddenly find themselves having become, a part of the critical infrastructure supply chain. So I suppose we're heading in that direction. I mean, if companies that are getting swept up in that critical infrastructure legislation that might not have thought that they would be there.
Yeah, and there will be. There will be a lot of smaller organizations that sit in the supply chain of, let's say, the power industry distributors. There will be contractors, subcontractors that sort of sit in the supply chain that have access to, critical infrastructure systems that will be swept up. The interesting thing is, as part of that bill, part of the amendment, they include this thing called a positive security obligation. Positive, or PSO, is basically, think of it as a capability that you must have if you are listed as a critical infrastructure provider or an asset. These PSOs are they're governed by rules which are turned off and on by the government, depending on who the organization is. So if you are part of the Enhanced Critical Infrastructure Acts, think power stations, etc., and you are one of these smaller companies, the government may choose to turn that on, and you will have to meet that obligation, which usually means it's an additive cost, number of people, etc., you've got to invest in. Or if it's not as critical, there's not an enhanced critical infrastructure asset, they may choose not to turn it on. So there is a feature in the bill to sort of to try and tune it, so it's not a one size fits all. But the unfortunate thing will be that some smaller companies will have the cost of doing business driven up because they have to meet these new regulatory requirements.
So, and I think you brought up the APRA cyber focus regulation before. I think that's actually been quite successful, hasn't it? In terms of kind of driving not just awareness but action through the financial services supply chain.
Yeah, it has been, and I was a part of both the APRA consultancy as well as this new critical infrastructure bill consultancy. So we're hundreds and thousands of other people, and I think the phases that they went through in terms of consultation, submissions from industry, etc., the different rounds of workshops that they both ran through, both APRA as well as the Home Affairs, has meant that the regulatory regime that's come out is a lot more robust than would have been if it was just top-down driven out to organizations. But you are right. I mean, one of the features of the APRA regulation is it's risk-based, right? So it depends on who you are, the number of the amount of assets that you manage, etc. And APRA takes that view in terms of them coming into 1 year, and the next year or the next 6 months they may come back in, and as long as they can see improvement and a plan to get that done, they usually won't go down the stick route. And I think Home Affairs will do a similar thing in critical infrastructure.
Okay, now to Jeffery Koch, I wanted to ask you just on privileged access management. Is obviously it's probably an aging term, I suppose. When we talk about critical infrastructure in relation to things like driverless cars or that level of automation through through society. So where does it sit? Where does it sit now? Like, we don't really talk about privileged access anymore. We're talking about identity, aren't we?
I think there's both. I think what was just privileged access has started evolving in the past couple of years. Think about today. A lot of your users, what they do become privileged depends at some point in time, right? Most of the time, I might be a normal user, but at times there are certain functions that I perform as a normal user that might be privileged. So I think going into 5G, into the IoT space, that has greatly expanded, right? A lot of the traditional OT environment are now being, I would say, breached across with the IT environment to get better efficiency. And as a result, what used to be just privileged access management is starting to evolve to people looking at, all right, we can't just be looking at only privilege, but we need to look at identity security as a whole. Because, with the new merge, you can, and expansion into the cloud, the only thing that stays true is an identity, right? Every user, accessing every application, you have an identity. Every application talking to another application, there is an identity for them to, authorize and authenticate to each other. So I think where we need to think about is in this new world order is to think about how do we secure all the identities that proliferate across the organization, not just on the privilege, but across every one of them, because those identity, right, at some point in time can turn privilege. And if you don't protect them, they will have a trickle down negative effect down the road. So I think that has been, I think a lot of the critical infrastructure organizations are relooking at how they are conducting their business, right? Their OT environment, which used to be air-gapped and locked away, has started expanding because of all the benefits that the new world order is bringing to them, right? So, for example, it used to be that OT has to be a closed network. But now, if they could have sensors over 5G that are out in the plantations, out in the field, right? And suddenly the way that they conduct business will be different. So a lot of the OT start to look a lot more like IT. In fact, now, we used to talk to different people. Now we talk to people that are IT/OT because, there's now this drastic change in how business are being conducted.
All right. Look, I'm going to start winding down in a minute, but Lani, I think you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, no, I would agree with Jeffery. I mean, one of the projects that I worked on last year was around a power utility who had set up sensors that sort of measured lag and power lines across regional areas. Now, because of the critical nature of their OT network, they set this up as a self-sustained sort of 4G as well as MPLS backbone back through their carrier. And this was always going to be separate, right? But to Jeffrey's point, at some stage, someone made a decision that they needed to aggregate and sort of correlate data across both networks. And so they started building bridges between, this standalone sort of network, which was, had a much higher level of risk, and their OT network. And I think it was within about 6 to 7 months, they'd actually created a bridge across both networks to facilitate data sharing, right? And as Jeffrey noted, that no longer becomes this air gap network. It actually becomes part of the corporate, just an extension of the corporate IT network.
Wow. I mean, I guess a lot of people had some hair falling out along the way with worry with that, but I guess it's all a risk management exercise. Okay, I'm talking to Lani Refiti, Chief Executive of IoTSec Australia, and Jeffery Kok, the Singapore-based Vice President of Solution Engineers at CyberArk. I'm just going to finish up with the same question for both of you. 5G sounds like, if I'm looking back, it seems like it's been a long time coming. But then, but it's kind of here, and it doesn't. It seems to have arrived very quickly. I guess that's the nature of tech. Finishing up on a high note, what are you most looking forward to? What's the step change that you think you'll see that you're most excited by? Lani, let's start with you.
Look, I think on a personal level, it's just the increased bandwidth, decreased latency, in terms of simple things, like Netflix or streaming, etc. I think that for me, that's the immediate benefit. But I think, if I look at an industry benefit, the increase in terms of the capability that we'll have to roll out IoT sensors across, smart cities, etc. I think I'm really excited in terms of societal impact that will have.
What about you, Jeffrey? What are you looking forward to?
Well, a lot of things. I've been watching a couple of interesting innovations in how 5G can be used to make a better world, if you will. I think off the top of my head, the two that appealed to me most was on healthcare and on farming. So on healthcare, where we have seen projects where people in remote areas, right, be shipped with covered by 5G IoT devices that can measure their vitals and be able to have more effective telemedicine. Right, it saves a lot of efficiency, especially in remote and vast areas, seeking timely medical attention or medical monitoring. And likewise for farming, I think, what was done in Netherlands, where they do smart farming, right, could be a lot more efficient and scaled out to a much larger scale, with 5G, simply because of the coverage, that bandwidth, and what we could do with it.
All right, two areas that slots right into, some areas of Australian expertise in healthcare and agriculture, or ag tech in particular. They're looking forward to some of these new 5G applications and developing their own. Okay, Lani Refiti, Chief Executive of IoTSec Australia, thank you very much for joining me. And Jeffery Kok from CyberArk, also, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, James. It's been a pleasure.